I'm just going to briefly walk through some of the things that are happening in the state of higher ed right now and workforce. A lot of what you all viewed for your homework in those videos is kind of related to what I'm going to talk about, but I'm just going to try to help you understand the framework for how a lot of these, working groups or workshops or studies kind of lead to very interesting, can have the potential to lead to very interesting policy changes. So, one theme that I know you all saw as you were listening to those presentations is that promoting changes in the scientific workforce and in education, not just in STEM, honestly, in any realm, is very, very difficult, and it requires a lot of radical systematic change. So, taking a lot of examples that are not necessarily related to STEM, but right now there's a lot of discussion about American competitiveness in science and technology, and understanding like what are the jobs of the future going to look like. And people are still trying to understand what policies are necessary, what training programs are necessary for us to be prepared for the future. And it takes a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different ideas. And even then, it's very hard to move the needle in this area. So it is not light work, as people say. Some of the key questions that people are thinking about in any policy decision-making format are, what are the key issues? These are like, for example, we're going to touch on some key issues today that were touched on in your previous presentations, but in higher ed, there's issues with diversity, there's issues with job availability, there's issues with mentorship, things like that. When we're thinking about higher ed and workforce readiness, what are the issues that you think about? And then you have to think about what's the agenda. So depending on who the stakeholder is, right? A university's agenda is going to be very different than a student's agenda, which might be very different than someone who's in industry's agenda. And so, depending on where you're coming from on the issue, you have to kind of figure out, well, what your agenda is, what you want your outcome to be, and how like, if you do have an issue with a particular area, like, how do you see it improving? And then another good question to ask, in which if you ever take the time to sit down to read a Long Academy's report, you'll kind of see the answers to all these questions in those reports. But another thing is to think about is, what are all the options, right? So there are going to be several different routes to get to the end goal that you may have. When you think about, I'm trying to think of an example. For example, with diversity in the workforce, right? A lot of people say, okay, we need to improve culture within universities. So Black and Brown people, LGBTQ plus community feel more comfortable in these predominantly white spaces. But then you could hear from another policymaker, they would say, no, we just need to improve training programs at institutions that are made for people of color, like minority serving institutions, for example, and pull more talent from those places. Both are right, but they're different options, right? So that's just like one of the things I could think of at the top of my head. But there's lots of different ways to approach very key issues that we see take place in education and workforce. Then another thing is the steps to implementation. So what has to be done? Who do you have to talk to? What are your policy levers, right? So, does a rule at a funding agency need to change for your policy to work? Does a university need to update their policies and procedures? Do you need to financially invest in something for your idea to work? So there's lots of different levers to implementing whatever your agenda and specific policy option may be. And then you always want to think about, at the end, you want to think about this before you implement, whatever decision you're going to make. It's how you're going to evaluate success. One important thing that I think a lot of people forget when we're making changes and we want to recommend policy changes is that We have to prove to some governing body, depending on where it's at, whether it's federal government, local government, government within your own university, we have to eventually show people why it was a positive change. Why was it a good decision? Because if we make a policy decision and we don't have anything to show for it, or we don't have like a baseline and we don't have a way to show improvement and show any success, then it won't seem like it was worth the trouble, right? And so when we are in the business in the area of policy decision making, we want to make sure that we are a force that can continue to be relied on to make more policy decisions. So you have to think about a lot of the metrics up front, so you know that once it's implemented, it ends up being a full success. And so one thing that I kind of touched on at the beginning is that policy changes in this space are very difficult. And a lot of that is due to the varying priorities of key stakeholder groups. And I'm sure your presentations touched on this. The PI has a different viewpoint than the grad student. We know that. Even within grad students, a international grad student is going to have a very different viewpoint than someone who is from the United States, right? Postdocs, depending on, it's even split within postdocs. You think about the classic story of, those who are funded on a training grant versus those who are funded on a research grant, different priorities, different issues, right? Different struggles. So there's just a lot of different things, a lot of different stakeholders. And then you have like industry, government, so you start to bring in all these different aspects, nonprofits, and everyone has a different angle. And so it's really, really hard to get everyone on the same page, which is why we often have a lot of convening groups to kind of think about how policy should be implemented. So the first thing I'm going to touch on that was touched on in your previous presentations was the conversation about broadening scientific training. So these are just some examples of reports and things that were done to kind of think about this thinking about ways to broaden scientific training and thinking of policy recommendations that could be implemented to actually broaden scientific training. And so the first study I want to talk about, I'm sure this was talked about in Lita's presentation, the graduate STEM education for the 21st century. So a little anecdote, I was a fellow at the academies when they started working on this report. And the first thing someone told me was that we did this same report 20 years ago and no one took any of the recommendations. So one thing to know about a lot of these working groups and consistent study reports that come at the academies is that they'll present recommendations for various stakeholders, but that doesn't always mean they're going to be implemented. But the good thing about these reports is that they do walk through those questions that we talked about on the last slide. And they're excellent resources for identifying the issues, understanding the problem, finding various agendas to improve on the problem, and it kind of weighs in on what each stakeholder can do to get to a similar positive point, right? So a lot of the recommendations in this was about updating curriculum because, the classic story is there's not enough tenure track positions for all of us. How are we going to improve graduate education so students are actually ready for the future workforce? And so another thing that has obviously been an issue is mentorship in STEM. And so, when we're thinking about through the lens of another issue with us not broadening scientific training is that it's limited, right? It's only made for a certain person. 100 years ago in this apprenticeship model, right, the classic graduate student was probably a white male. And of course, all that person wanted to do was go on and be exactly who their white male principal investigator was. In this new world where there's people from so many different backgrounds, so many different interests, we have to understand that the apprenticeship model doesn't work. And how can we provide different layers of mentorship so people can go on and feel empowered to have other jobs, right? And so this, thinking about mentorship, this study did a lot of work to really unpack all of the things that impact mentorship, how having effective mentorship can really support diversifying the workforce and support broadening scientific training as well. And another note is that the academies is not the only body that, you know, does working groups. A lot of times federal agencies will have their own working groups to evaluate themselves. So NIH does it, NSF does it. And even in those agencies, you would think, you know, the academies, which is a separate body, they have their working group, they provide recommendations. Sometimes stakeholders don't follow up on the recommendations. But even the agencies, they have their working groups and they also don't follow their own recommendations that they provided in their own working group. So, you know, it takes a lot of time to get to implementation, but there's a lot of steps to kind of get to the recommendation stage. So I put this example on here because, you know, it should be close to Harinder's heart. You know, years ago, NIH released a funding program and they really wanted to test out ways to improve career workforce development. And so they gave these awards to all these schools and they were like, we're going to give you this money to basically broaden, you know, scientific training on the graduate student level. And once this, you know, pilot was over, NIH was kind of like, okay, cool. Like we did the pilot. We're going to write a report about it, which I've put here. We're going to give all these recommendations. So now all the schools in the world can just follow this paper and implement these programs on their own. Now, we all know a lot of the programs that were implemented at schools like UC Irvine were implemented because they had additional funds to do it. And so, but sometimes that's where the buck ends, right? NIH at this point, this is how they implemented their idea of what the policy change would be to improve broadening scientific training. They were like, okay, we piloted it out. You know, we got these results. Here's the paper. Go be fruitful and do it yourself. And so, and, you know, a lot of us, you know, in my day job, I'm a lobbyist. A lot of our clients want to see money poured back into this. And so that's kind of like how we can move the needle. Like we have the recommendations, we know it needs to be done. And sometimes now you just need to push the funding lever to get more of it out there. So these are some other reports. I'm not gonna, did you want to add, Harinder?
Oh, there was one question from, I think it's relevant to the mentoring.
Oh,
we also know if there's any data. Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead if you want to take it.
Is there any data on how quality mentorship affects scientific output test publications? I'm not sure if that data is in that study in particular. I can't remember. But that would be an interesting question. I know there's been a lot of conversations about how we should not be using output and publications to measure success. Because it takes so much more money and so much more time to really get significant results these days. We really should just honor, you know, what is it, proof of concept experiments, things of that nature, because they're just as hard and they're just as important. So yeah, I'm not sure if the mentorship study touched on that, but they have a whole website with all, like, they have a really cool interactive website related to that study. And I can share it in the chat once I'm done. In which they can, somebody dropped something in the chat. So yeah, so there's probably stuff out there. But yeah, I know there is a lot of conversations about not associating publications and output with success. So that's been a huge topic of conversation.
Yeah. So there's one thing I can add. I'm not aware about the data related to mentoring, but especially since you mentioned, Nicole, about NIH BEST being close to my heart. So NIH BEST, with all the data which was collected out of the total 10 sites actually added data on the participation in career and professional development programming, and they used the dosing as, you know, how much you participated, and they compared the time to degree for those candidates and how many publications they got. So that publication is out. I'm going to add in the chat, but it actually showed that the more you participate in career and professional development activities, like a policy course like this, you take shorter time to graduate, or the same as people who did not participate in these programs, or you have same or higher number of publications, first, second, third, middle author publications, if you participated more in these programs. So that data is out there, but mentoring, I think it's still a lot of work in progress to actually have a data like this coming out soon.
There was another question that says, in my opinion, would it be better to propose smaller policy changes in education or larger, potentially more radical changes? So this is going to be completely biased, and it's going to be because of what I work in on a normal basis. So most of my work is with NIH, where, you know, in my job, I literally work to lobby to get NIH to make a policy changes, and they don't like to change. So we've always found that the best way for us to create policy change in biomedical research and in the workforce in that space is to implement small little nudges that kind of give us a win. And so actually, I'll kind of share an example next. So let me just click out of this question thing. Oh, sorry. Could you all see the chat when how do I go back?
No,
I'm in Google Slides. I don't know how to go back when I'm in Google
Slides. Are you okay now? Like, you able to do it?
Oh, wait, no. Hold on. I'll just do this instead.
Okay, yeah.
Technology. Anywho, so the next thing I wanted to touch on really quickly is diversity, because I know that was talked about a lot. I'm not going to spend too much time on the academy reports, but I did want to share a pretty cool example of, you know, policy at work. So, you know, Congress has the power of the purse. So one thing that can make NIH kind of start to implement some policy changes is if Congress tells them to. And so what I've screenshotted here, this is report language from the House spending bill. And this report language is directed toward NIH. And basically Congress is saying, we want NIH to provide a strategic plan and recommendations on how they're going to improve diversity in the workforce, improve health disparity research. Due to that is, you know, the constant concern that there's just a lack of diversity in biomedical research in general. And that was a very, very huge issue throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. There was just a lot of mistrust in the government when it was related to the creation of the vaccines. And Congress was really, really passionate about making sure that we found more ways to have more scientists look like the nation, right? You know, we want to be able to build trust in communities of color, and they understand that it's important for, you know, people to talk to people that look like them, so on and so forth. So in last year's bill, they were like, we've been asking you to figure out this diversity thing for a long time. Now we want this strategic plan, we want recommendations, and we want this within 180 days of the bill being enacted. Now, there's wiggle room here because this report language is just guidance. So a lot of times you can get a little bit of pushback, and NIH can say, okay, we're going to do it, but we need more than 180 days. But what I will say is it did lead to some movement in that area. So a lot of you all probably have heard of this new program, but NIH now has a program called Unite, and they are working towards ending structural racism in biomedical research. And so this is how, you know, they were instructed to come up with a strategic plan and recommendations. And they decided in order to do that, they really wanted to take time to survey the entire extramural community. And so what I screenshotted down below that is the RFI, which they issued last April. I think it was April or last March. And they, you know, they sent this out, and they really wanted everyone to respond on how they can improve racial equity, improve diversity, and improve their health disparity and health equity research portfolios. And so a lot of what NIH has been talking about lately is using responses from this RFI, doing internal surveys at the agency to kind of come up with the strategic plan that Congress asked for 180 days after the bill. Now they're probably going to get it like a year after the bill was enacted, but you know, it's a way in which a policy can really, push for some change, at least in this higher ed workforce space. Another thing that is a huge issue and was extremely exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic is mental health. So this here is just another study that the Academies has great studies. And I'll say this one thing about the National Academies. A lot of times studies can come up two ways, and I'm sure Lita spoke on this, but they can either be requested by Congress, or they can be requested by federal agencies. So like NIH might ask for a report from the academies. And they also can be just paid for by nonprofits, like, I don't know, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, some, very, nonprofits with a lot of money can also fund these studies. And they definitely lead to a lot of great recommendations. And so I just put these reports on the screen so you can take time to in your free time, whenever you have it, kind of look through them, and you can see how they frame the issue and what recommendations they provided. And when you look at the list of participants for the study, you'll see how the National Academies does a really good job of pulling from various stakeholders. So I think that's just another interesting thing to see within the report. But here with mental health, it's been extremely exacerbated during COVID-19. A lot of people have been feeling isolation. A lot of scientists who are working, scientists and nurses and doctors working on the front line during COVID, trying to produce results and save lives. They're stressed out to the max because they're working harder than they've ever worked before. And so Congress Congress understands this, they hear it, and sometimes they're quick to move. So Congress has really been talking about mental health legislation a lot. And this screenshot is an example of a legislative hearing that was held in last year's Congress, in which there have been several hearings where they all came together just to kind of look at legislation for mental health and really create a group of bills that they want to pass to improve mental health services throughout the nation. And so, a lot of this was related to schools, especially K through 12 as well. There's a huge focus in K through 12, but a lot of things can be reactionary. I feel like this is an example. Mental health has always been important, right? This is just an example of how in policy it was very reactionary to act on mental health in Congress, because this was it wasn't dormant, but a lot of the bills that were marked up during these hearings had been introduced almost every Congress for the past 10 years. But because this crisis was occurring and mental health was so, mental health illness had been exacerbated to a point where there was just a large increase in the services needed. Now they were starting to pay attention. So there's a lot of different ways you can get to policy change. It can come from reports such as this, in which there's going to be recommendations. It can come from crisis, like the pandemic. I'm anticipating to see a lot of future policy change just based on crisis. And it could just be because, someone in Congress is really, really interested in it and they fought really hard to get their report language in, and you have to do it because they want it, right? So, and there's other reasons too, but just to give you a feel of how a lot of these things are being addressed currently in the field and in Congress and with federal agencies. And hopefully that kind of helps you put a more, kind of helps you see how it's working in action versus what was provided in the presentations.